Hello, everyone. Um, Thanks for the invitation, and I'm really excited to be here and share some of our research with you about parking and the urban climate. As Paula just said, I'm a assistant professor at the Vanderbilt University, and my lab is mainly focused on understanding how climate change and urbanizations affect trees, and how can we use trees and vegetation, green space as a nature-based solution to build more sustainable cities. And my recent project is about focusing on parking lot, and we are using the data set developed by Parking Reform Network, and great to uh, get engaged with you all. Um, we care about cities because cities really play a critical role in shaping our global future. Right now, there's 83% of the US population living in urban areas, and based on the model projection, by the year 2050, there's 68% of the global population is expected to live in cities. Although urban areas only occupy 3% of the Earth's surface, urban areas are responsible for 75% of global carbon dioxide emission. So they're really a hotspot for both human activities and the environmental and climate impact. And this high concentration of people and emissions really means there's an urgent need um, for sustainable urban development and climate solutions. So they really present us cities really present us a great opportunities, to rethink how to design city and how to use nature-based solution to transform cities. And one of the environmental challenges in cities are this so-called island effect. Because the way we build cities, we have a very distinct urban climate compared to that in rural areas. For example, there's a high temperature in cities, it's called urban heat island effect. And then there's a low relative humidity in cities. We call it urban dry island effect. And urban highly polluted. So there's higher pollution concentration. We call it urban pollution island. And among all these three island effects, urban heat island is the most prominent effect, especially under climate change, because we know rising temperature is one of the most significant aspects of climate change. And urban heat island effect is kind of, we add additional layers on top of climate warming. We have urban heat island effect because we have all this dense infrastructure and heat retain and absorb materials. And this is just one spatial map that's shown in Knoxville, one cities in Tennessee where I live. The bottom map shows the land surface temperature of the city. And we can see, for those rural or forested areas, they have pretty low temperature. But for urbans with all these buildings, road, pavement, the temperature is really high. And if we zoom in to the center of the city, Knoxville, we can see this the spatial pattern of the temperature correlated well with the type of land cover. And this is a small town near Knoxville called Oak Ridge. And this is a national laboratory at Oak Ridge. And you can see here on the north of this map, this area in impervious surface is actually a big parking lot. It's a huge parking lot in the middle of the forest. And we can see the temperature of that parking lot is like clearly higher than the surrounding forest. And there's also an edge effect. So the temperature effect is not only, in the parking lot, but it also affects the nearby forest. And as one of the solutions, green infrastructure play a huge role to improve urban environment and mitigate this urban heat stress. So this is a common way that people use green infrastructure in the urban environment to address these environmental challenges. There's green roofs, green walls for building thermal regulation, and there's green space, street vegetation that can provide shading and promote biodiversity. And there's urban parks that can help with carbon sequestration and recreation. So trees really provide this multifunctional benefit in cities. In the city where I live in Nashville, we have this Music City Center, and this conventional center, like the roof of this conventional center has all kinds of techniques. There's a cool roof. It's white, highly reflective roof to keep the building cool. And there's green roof. It's natural grasses that provide evapotranspiration cooling effect. And there's also solar panel that can generate power from sunlight. So this is a great example showing how we can use this different roof techniques as nature-based solution for a sustainable city design. And we see this kind of building more and more. And the reason I start to focus on parking lot, because parking lot really play a huge role in urban heat island. In the US, they are extensive, they're impervious surface that they absorb and retain large amount of heat. And this traditional asphalt parking lot not only have very low reflectivity, they trap heat, but they also lack trees and vegetation that exacerbate the problems. And reforming this traditional parking lot really offer a unique opportunity to address urban heat stress challenges by using a variety of strategies, cooler materials, vegetations, and solar panel. So my overall project is to assess the urban heat effect from this paved parking lot using satellite data for all the major cities in the US, and then quantify this occupation ratio and identify what is the drivers that contribute most to this elevated temperature. And then based on that, to design different greening scenarios using model to transfer paved parking lot. And then as a third step, to evaluate this short-term and long-term climate benefit of various greening scenarios using this microclimate model. And in the first step, this when I assess the urban heat effect of the parking lot, I use this parking data set from Parking Reform Network for 100 cities in the US. And then I overlay that parking boundary with the satellite images of temperature and the impervious surface to look at the characteristic of each parking lot. So this top map really shows the coverage, the percentage of the areas of parking lot in downtown for 100 cities across the US. And on average, the coverage is almost 20%. So there's 20% of areas are used for parking. And then the bottom figure shows impervious surface areas. So if it's 100%, that means like 100% of the areas are impervious, which means they they don't allow water to infiltrate into the ground, and instead this rainwater will run off their surface that contribute to urban flooding, and then they carry pollutant into waterway and exacerbate the urban heat island effect because they store and release this heat. And we can see most of the parking lots are highly impervious. So this is also a factor that contribute to urban heat stress. And on this bottom red figure, this shows the summer temperature of all this parking lot. And from this map, we can see there's a latitudinal patterns. Those cities in the desert or semi-arid areas have a higher temperature, and those cities in the higher latitude in the north has lower temperature. And more interestingly, when we look at each specific cities and we look at all these parking areas in each cities, we found there's a pretty large spatial variation of temperature, LST, land surface temperature for this different parking lot. There are some parking lots that are extremely hot. And for impervious surface areas, most of them are pretty high. And we found there is a pretty good correlation between impervious surface areas and temperature, which means if a parking lot are mostly impervious, then it's likely to be very hot. And on average, across these 100 cities, we found the parking lot 2.8 degrees Celsius warmer than the nearby green space on an annual scale. And for summer, this temperature difference is the highest, is 4.1 degrees Celsius. And that's pretty profound. All right, so this is our preliminary result. We're still working on this project. And our next step is to come up with different reform scenarios, including reduce the areas of the parking lot or add tree lines or grass in the parking lot, or convert or use this high albedo coating or permeable pavement to replace the impervious surface areas of the parking lot, and see what are the climate benefit of these different scenarios for the future. And we think those solutions coupled with urban design standards can hopefully can help transform parking lot from heat contributors into urban cooling asset. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was great. I've seen some of this already, and it's as you since you worked on it with us, and it's pretty exciting. I wonder, you mentioned a bit about the stormwater and water quality, but I'm curious if there are broader impacts specifically from reducing the impervious surfaces or altering this coverage, like you mentioned, as some strategies to adding trees or other things on urban microclimates like air quality or stormwater. I remember one of the first facts you taught me was that light pollution is a big thing also that comes from parking lots. Are there mitigations? Are there strategies you think are more effective and broad? And yeah, I'm just curious about beyond the heat island impact.
Yeah, absolutely. So these different reform scenarios will definitely enhance urban microclimate in general, that beyond this temperature regulation alone, because they'll contribute to improve air quality, and there's a stormwater management aspect, and there's also this ecosystem health. For example, if we replace this impervious surface with natural or semi-natural habitat, at support urban biodiversity. They will attract pollinators and birds and other wildlife that can provide this habitat for urban wildlife. And those vegetated areas, even if just a very small portion of the parking lot that have trees or grass, they help filter stormwater and they remove contaminants such as those heavy metals and oil and nutrient, which often accumulate on impervious surface. They also help with urban flooding risk, especially during this extreme rain event. So there's a series of benefit from using this nature-based solution to reform parking lot.
Great. And this is a quick one, or maybe a quick one, but Paul Barter just asked about solar panels. This is we see this come up a lot in social media or other places, the idea of putting solar panels over parking lots as environmental or climate action. How does that perform? Would you expect that would perform in mitigating some of these issues?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, solar panel will not help much with improving urban heat stress. They will increase temperature a little bit, actually, because those solar panels are they have lower albedo, so they can absorb all the sunlight and then convert that to power. So those solar panels are in general hotter than typical paved parking lot.
Mhm.
So in terms of this urban climate, they don't really help like trees or grass, but they do have like convert the sunlight to power, and then it's renewable energy, so it's good in terms of this from the energy perspective.
Well, great. Okay. Well, we're going to come back for more group discussion and questions, but thank you so much.
All right. Well, thanks. It's great to be with y'all. I will start by just giving a little more background about Southern Environmental Law Center. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan environmental organization that works at the federal, state, and local level in all three branches of government. We have offices, they're shown on this map, they're in 6 states and DC. And we work on a range of environmental areas and issues. And our multifaceted approach includes legal advocacy, policy reform, outreach to communities, and public education. And we work on a host of environmental areas from the mountains to the coast in the Southeast, protecting rivers and streams as well, and rural areas as well as urban areas. And I'm the head of our transportation land use work. And among other things, we are working as part of our efforts to promote cleaner, more equitable transportation and smarter growth on parking reform. And often I have people kind of surprised to find an environmental group is working on parking. So why is it that environmentalists should care about parking? Well, parking really is at the intersection of a number of critical issues, not only some of the key issues that Lynn just mentioned, but it's really broader intersection between transportation, land use, climate, and housing. And parking is omnipresent. It is one of the most dominant features of both urban and suburban landscapes in this country, yet it really hasn't received a whole lot of attention. For the most part, it is hiding in plain sight. Estimates vary widely on the number of parking spaces in the US. Seen estimates ranging from 500 million to 2 billion parking spaces. So an enormous amount of asphalt and concrete covering a substantial amount of the surface area of many localities. And I'm focused mainly on off-street parking here, but abundant free parking is the norm and in fact is required in most localities. minimum parking requirements that a business has to provide are written into local ordinances, often without a very firm basis, and have resulted in vastly overbuilt amounts of parking. And as a consequence, parking is a primary driver of a number of major environmental problems, primarily from the subsidy it produces that fuels vehicle use and the resulting sprawl by taking up so much land for parking and pushing businesses farther out where land is less expensive to meet the local parking requirements. And by increasing driving and sprawl, parking can also limit, if not destroy, the walkability of a community, as well as limit the effectiveness of cleaner alternatives such as transit. Yet, despite this, it's often not seen as an environmental issue. Lynn just mentioned a number of these. These are just some of the many environmental impacts that parking has. They're both direct and indirect impacts, but very briefly, one of the main ones is the impact on climate change. And I'll say a bit more about this one because transportation is the #1 source of climate pollution nationwide. And parking both spurs driving, as I mentioned, as well as the asphalt and concrete are responsible for a significant amount of carbon pollution as well. And then the space that all these parking spaces take up destroys a lot of our carbon sinks. Trees and other elements of the natural environment that can store carbon are destroyed in producing all this parking. There are a number of other air pollutants as well, that primarily from vehicles, such as particulate matter and toxic air pollutants. There's water pollution from runoff from pavement, which Lynn just did a great job of talking about some of those impacts. And then all those impervious surfaces can also contribute to flooding as well as heat islands. And as mentioned, it's a major driver of sprawl and loss of open space. I'd also like to note that these impacts are not distributed equally. Instead, a disproportionate share of the pollution that results from vehicles is borne by communities of color as well as lower wealth communities. So, given all these impacts, there's, I think, enormous and growing interest in the realization of the need to reform our parking policies. So what can we do? The good news is that policies created much of our parking problems, and so policy reform can substantially address these problems and reduce these environmental impacts. Parking reform is really essential to promoting cleaner, more equitable transportation, as well as smarter growth patterns. Most importantly, we need to address parking minimum requirements, which I mentioned. These are often very excessive requirements, and this can be done either by eliminating requirements altogether, which some localities have done and left it to the market basically to provide parking, at least in certain areas, or also some localities have begun to adopt parking maximums that actually cap the amount of parking on one site. Another strategy is promoting shared parking, where adjacent uses can actually share the parking, especially if they operate and see different peak times. It's another way to reduce the overall number of parking spaces we're building. And this is a focus more on off-street parking. For on-street parking in particular, an important strategy is pricing, to actually put a little bit more of the true cost of providing all this parking on the people who are using the parking. And in addition, some localities have limited the amount of pervious surface covering or provided incentives for pervious instead of impervious parking, and a number of the other strategies that Lynn mentioned. And then we've seen a significant increase in the adoption of parking reforms as localities begin to address some of these antiquated measures that they really just haven't paid too much attention to a lot of the environmental damage from parking is a very unintended consequence. And we're only really just getting some really good data on the full extent of some of these impacts. Two of the ones we most recently worked on were Birmingham, Alabama, which adopted a package of solutions as part of their right-size parking initiative, and also Richmond, Virginia, where they adopted in their comprehensive plan and then their multimodal transportation plan called for reducing and in some places eliminating parking minimums. And then they've actually made some of the zoning ordinance changes to implement this. We're seeing, again, more localities throughout the country adopt these and other changes that offer significant environmental as well as health and safety, equity, and economic benefits, and affordable housing benefits as well. All through putting people over emphasizing the importance of car storage. So it's a very exciting area to see the changes that are coming together and some of the coalitions that are being built in localities that it's not always some of the usual groups you see aligned, but increasingly, I think environmental groups are recognizing the significance of this and expect that to fully continue. And again, there's just enormous potential since some of these policies are what created the mess. Policy reform can help clean it up. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Trip. A couple question for you, and if anyone has one in the chat, we can might be able to read that out. But I was wondering, around the Southeast, is kind of infamously, or at least people will tell you when you try to promote parking reforms in the Southeast that it's very car centric and decentralized, and that's the reason you can't do it there as opposed to other places. Now, big secret, every region says this about their region, pretty much. But we've seen some good momentum, as you mentioned, with Birmingham and Raleigh and Durham and other places in the South and Southeast that have been doing these reforms. Is there a trend here that holds any lessons, and how much have environmental concerns played into those campaigns? Like how much has that been part of what is that are environmental concerns is it salient to people there? Is it something that catches them, and are there specific ones maybe? So just let's talk about
yeah, they definitely, environmental concerns have been important, and while this webinar is focused on those environmental impacts, it's really, as I mentioned, there are multiple benefits of these parking policy reforms. And so environmental is definitely part of the mix. Housing affordability is an increasing part of the argument as people recognize how much land is taken up in our, especially downtown areas often, and the economic benefits. So, and then the health benefits also from reduced pollution. So it's these multiple benefits are what we're seeing in the Southeast are being cited. For example, in Richmond, Virginia, the planning documents I mentioned, the comprehensive plan and then the multimodal transportation plan, specifically pointed to affordable housing and air pollution and climate change as three of the main reasons to significantly revamp the parking ordinances. So it's really a blend, and we're seeing, again, it's not only that those are the benefits and reasons people are giving, but it's also bringing groups who work on those issues, I think, together and realizing there's common ground in tackling this problem.
Great. Thanks. Well, we're going to move on to Rebekah's presentation, and then, as I mentioned, we'll all come back for a longer chat and Q&A. Let me spotlight you, Rebekah.
Awesome. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Rebekah. Here's two adorable photos of my dog. Just to give you a little bit of background, I live in Charlotte. I've been doing work with the Sierra Club starting 9.5 years ago, off and on. I've started at both the local level and then at the statewide level, because DC should be a state in my mind. And then now I work on the national level around clean transportation for all. And then in Charlotte, I'm also a planning commissioner for the city county here. So a little bit about the Sierra Club. So we have 64 chapters across the country. Most of them are state-based. Some of them are county-based in California, because California is massive. And then kind of also along those lines, we also have groups that kind of live within the chapters as well. And so I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of a overview of what the Sierra Club is. And so, as mentioned by Paula earlier, the Sierra Club has been involved in urban sprawl, a challenging urban sprawl for a while. And so our kind of advocacy around it started in the 1990s. And then since then, it's kind of grown into, putting together a policy and then putting together a guidance that is more advisory and toolkit oriented. Because what we started to notice is that there were volunteers that were opposing housing projects in a place that needs a lot of housing. And their reasoning was along the lines of, natural areas. And so what we wanted to start to really dig into is, how can we find a good balance? And that's kind of where our policy came into play. And it was finalized in 2019. And then right after that, we came up with our guidance that, again, is just a guidebook and a toolkit. And so tonight you've heard from a scientist and then a legal eagle who are absolutely wonderful and amazing. And I kind of come from this sort of work as an organizer and a relationship type of person of how can you get what you want done? And so kind of in working on this, this is kind of the work that I've been helping. And so who did we consult? You just heard Trip mention kind of partners. And so the folks that we talked to over a 5-year period when we were putting together both our policy and our guidance, some might not think of these type of groups. And so we talked to the American Planning Association, we talked to Urban Institutes, the Green Lining Institute, Congress for New Urbanism, or CNU, as I think a lot of folks have heard, and then National Multifamily Housing Council, Trust for Public Land, the Transit Equity Network. And so I'm not going to read all of these, but we also really just wanted to make sure that we were including our volunteers that come from, again, all those 64 chapters across the Sierra Club. And part of that reasoning is because we wanted to make sure that, number one, folks were on board with kind of what smart growth and infill can look like and how parking reform plays into that, how zoning reform plays into that, how affordable housing plays into that. And so for the policy, we really wanted to focus on housing for all, transit, bike, and pedestrian first approaches, expanded opportunities for economic, including living wage jobs, a balance of economic opportunities and housing, and then access to services to make sure that we're also reducing vehicle miles traveled at the same time, that basically at the same time, so then we can reduce the pollution that is impacting every single community, no matter where you live. And so the guidance that we put together and really kind of falls into 5 buckets, which very briefly talked about, so I'm not going to talk about it again. But essentially it's infill, housing, transit, resiliency, and labor. And I'm going to skip that. And so I remember when I was first talking to a local chapter staffer who I believe was on the West Coast, and we were talking about parking. And I said, well, y'all could look at getting rid of parking mandates. And they said, well, how does that work? And then I kind of went through kind of like the spiel that I feel like those of us that have been involved in this work kind of have, around like it increases green spaces, it reduces urban sprawl, it decreases car dependency. As you heard from the professor, it helps reduce urban heat island effect. And it also improves stormwater management, which is where a lot of the issues around some of this work actually falls into. And it also promotes carpooling and car sharing. And so then kind of the question with the staffer that I was talking to was like, well, how do I do this? And so from my perspective, I was like, oh, well, like comprehensive plans or unified development ordinances, like in your local municipality. But the other thing that I think is sometimes lost with this is, in some of the activist work that I do, um, outside of my planning commissioner hat, I always say, like, know your enemy, but developers shouldn't be enemies. We need to be really willing to work with them, to really be able to get what we want. Whether that's, for example, solar on housing, whether that's trying to figure out a way to get less parking spaces. And then you can also try a statewide approach, on legislation. There's a state on the West Coast that is going to be attempting to push a parking reform bill later this year, which is super exciting. And I was told that I could not say which state, but I will be talking to Parking Reform Network about it probably next week, or they already know about it. But from kind of my organizing hat, one of the ways or there are lots of ways to kind of get involved in organizing around these issues. And one of the most important things that I think is know kind of your area. So look at current and historical census data, get to know the lay of the land, and meet your planning commissioners. It's normally a permanent committee appointed by the government council or board of supervisors. So I am the school board representative for Mecklenburg County. And so the school board appointed me to serve on the planning commission. Super fun. I love it. It's incredibly time consuming, but one of the most time consuming things and the most enjoyable part of it is getting to talk to folks that live in areas that want to try to make a development better. And so while, that is going through a lot of emails, and having a lot of phone calls every month, it is incredibly powerful to like hear people's actual reasoning as to why they support or what they want out of a development. And then also just researching and meeting organizations that are involved in land use. And one of the ways that I also say, which I know this is going to be a lot of work, but is read your city and county comprehensive transit economic development or neighborhood plans. They're very dense. I have read quite a few over the years, and they're incredibly dry, but a lot of them have really good graphics, which is what kind of keeps me going with some of these. But it's incredibly powerful to kind of get to know, like, okay, this is what they see as the vision. This is the Unified Development Ordinance. This is how they see the policy going into place. And so kind of be able to see, like, how do all of these plans kind of come together? And then also just go to your planning commission website, and figure out when the meetings are, and then also kind of see when, if you might be able to meet with a staffer that's there that works in the planning department, if the route that you want to go through is, at the kind of city county level. And I think that's all. Yeah, so hopefully it was helpful to hear kind of from like the research perspective, the legal perspective, and then the organizing perspective.
Thanks so much. I love that's what we do, like to try and put panels together with people from these different perspectives, and so that's part of the plan here. I'm curious. So it was interesting when I was listening to your presentation when you were talking about how you specifically were trying to kind of give your chapters a bit more reason to support these things. Have you charted kind of like, do the local chapters adopt these themselves, or do you have any idea of like, of the 64 chapters around, like how many are like bought into it and are on board with the infill policy?
Great question. I will say that there's, it is a national policy, so that's number one. Number two, I would say there has been a lot of education, and that's kind of what I've been leaning into, is having more of kind of, I would say every other month I'm like talking to a chapter or volunteers about our policy and our guidance and how to at least like kind of get to know what the issues are in the area, which is why actually the last couple slides that I put together are from like a webinar series that I did around how to get involved. And so I would say it's kind of like we're on an educational course is how I'm going to phrase it. We're getting there. We're getting there.
Are there things that PRN members or partner orgs, like if they are engaging in an area or they're looking at a campaign and they want to engage with their local Sierra Club chapter, like are there ways that they can help externally bring them along? Like, do you just ask like, does it help to be a member of the Sierra Club? Like, how do you influence the local chapter's decision, or is that possible?
That is a great question. So something that I always like to go into a meeting, like any meeting. I think even like the first time I met Paula was from PRN. I was just like, okay, here are the things that I know that we work on together or that we could work on together. And there are a few things that might differ. So I think going into a conversation, if you're wanting to do parking reform with the Sierra Club, going in knowing kind of like, what are the three things that I know we're going to agree on? We know that we agree that parking is an environmental issue. We know that stormwater is an issue, and then we know that parks are incredibly important. So those are three things. It's kind of like the how it happens that I think is where, some discourse might come into play.
Thanks. I mean, it's useful to just, to know. I think sometimes people think, or like AARP is a similar partner that's great on this, but they have a national policy, and some of their state organizations, they don't have a top-down approach. So you kind of have to work locally around it. Okay. Well, we're going to move into, I spotlighted everyone from the panel, and we're going to do some kind of questions in general for everybody. Please, if folks have questions from the audience, post them in the chat and we'll get them surfaced up and ask people. So the first thing, just kind of, we can do this quick, maybe go around. We've all seen you've seen each other's presentations. What do you think is, you can either ask a question to someone else, or what do you think is an interesting point or fact you heard from a co-presenter, and kind of what would be a primary takeaway you think for the audience? And feel free to go in whoever's order whoever wants to go first. Let's go around quick.
I actually have a question for Trip. So I know Southern Environmental Law Center works in the Southeast. So what is kind of the most surprising area or like city in the Southeast that you've seen really take like big strides in parking reform?
I would say maybe not surprising, but some of the cities that have adopted reforms aren't the ones that are thought of as the most progressive, like outside of those communities, but they're actually doing a lot of great work. And I would say two of the most recent ones wouldn't probably be on a lot of people's list of expected areas are Richmond, Virginia, and Birmingham, Alabama. I would say those are two that, they're actually doing a lot of great work in promoting more sustainable, equitable transportation and addressing smarter growth, but I don't think they would come to the top of most people's list nationally when they think of progressive localities, but they're both doing a lot of great work. Those would be two that I think would maybe surprise some people. And I guess I'll mention is not a question, but I think in terms of takeaways, I think one of the things I was particularly interested in was documenting some of your research, and I look forward to seeing kind of that next phase, some of the additional pieces you said you'd be looking into to see which of types of measures actually make some of the biggest difference in reducing the heat island effect.
Yeah. So from our preliminary result, we found for those high latitude northern cities and low latitude southern cities, their parking lot contribute very differently to urban heat stress, because those northern cities are often developed earlier and they have smaller parking lot, but their parking lot are highly impervious. So there's like no trees and no permeable surface. And in contrast, those southern cities, they got developed later and they have larger urban areas. So their um, city design is more like spread out instead of like concentrated. So they have larger parking areas, but sometimes they incorporate trees or other um, green element in the parking lot. So their parking lot imperviousness is lower. So we notice this regional difference in this parking lot characteristics. And that means if we want to, come up with reform scenarios to reduce heat effect from parking lot, we need to tailor the strategy based on the specific situation of different locations. For example, in the south, uh, um, reduce the areas of parking lot would be seem to be like the most effective way. But in the north, is like replace some of the impervious surface by permeable surface or add some grass or tree lines in the parking lot might be the most effective way. So it's interesting to see there's a regional difference, and the solution has to consider this regional difference. Yeah, and I have a questions for Rebecca about, when you engage with community and work with city and counties, I wonder, what do you notice they have whether they have different needs in terms of reform parking lot, or if they all, embrace removed this minimum parking requirement and embrace um, biking or alternative transportation instead of this a very car-centric design.
That's a really good question. I don't think that there will ever be a one size fits all solution to parking reform. I think that you definitely need to make sure that you're looking at how people get around, how horrible is transit, because I think we often kind of get into this dichotomy, or like people think that there's a chicken and egg. So like parking mandates and transit. When really it's kind of like, if you get rid of parking, transit has to get better. And transit should be better absolutely everywhere in every city in every single county. Transit is not great in the US. If you ever have a chance to spend any time in Europe, your mind will just be like, what? This is possible? And so I think that as long as folks are taking into account like what the actual needs are of the community, um I think that very similar to what I was saying about kind of like going into a meeting and knowing where you're going to agree, is that you need to know like, okay, we need to get rid of parking mandates. We need to, you know, reduce emissions from cars. Those are the two things that we can agree on, but how we get to that is what needs to be different. Um, Hopefully that was a good answer.
I was snapping my fingers. I mean, I think I always like to point out that, part of the reason the transit is not good and a major barrier to it getting better is what we've done with the parking, right? And so like, yeah, and also always to remind everybody, it's always good to just always bring up eliminating parking mandates doesn't remove the parking, whether you like that or not. Like it still allows it to be built, and what's there is still there. So that's, yeah. Well, great insight. I'm curious um on uh on so a question for everybody. You all can go, or whoever wants to. How are the burdens of the environmental degradation caused, like, or that we've been discussing, or the environmental concerns, how are they distributed among socioeconomic and racial lines? And does the existing or traditional kind of parking policy that we've got play into any imbalance that's there?
Yeah, I touched upon this very briefly, but that's an excellent question. And there's actually also a really good question in the chat that I'll maybe roll into answering that. Wes Stewart asked about if advocating for people-focused development, many people will push back that people need their cars and what's an effective response. So it's many of the environmental impacts of our current parking policies are extremely disproportionate in how those impacts and burdens are borne. Air pollution in particular, but it's on the whole, the burdens are not distributed equally. Communities of color suffer much higher rates of pollution from vehicle typically, and lower wealth communities. And that gets to this question about when people say people just need their cars, how do you respond to that? So there's really two main things. One is something you just touched on a moment ago, Tony. Eliminating these parking requirements that drive this incredibly overbuilt parking morass that we've created doesn't mean we're eliminating parking entirely. It's trying to move to a more sensible amount of parking, and amounts of parking that don't require everyone to walk everywhere. I mean, drive everywhere. So, and destroy walkability. So that's part of the response is people can still use their cars. There's still going to be parking, but the part of the goal is that people don't have to drive everywhere for everything. And the other thing is, it's important to keep in account that we raise about the argument that people need cars is a substantial percentage of the population either can't drive or can't afford a car. And these people are subsidizing parking for people who can afford a car. Because when you, for example, among other things, if you have onerous off-street parking, that cost is absolutely enormous. And those commercial businesses that have to pay for all that parking to be constructed, it's free to whoever can afford a car and drive there to park there. But the cost is going to be reflected and recouped through higher prices that everyone else has to pay, whether you drive or not. So people who are less well off are subsidizing, rough characterization, people who don't own a car and people who do own a car is usually an economic divide there. And the other thing is, I mean, just to give one example, in Birmingham, when we were advocating for the parking reform, some areas of downtown that are just covered with parking, like 25% or more, about 50% of the people in some of these areas don't own a car. So, I think we need to address this thing about people need their cars. It's a great question because we do hear that all the time as the pushback to these proposals. But I would say there's at least two main things. We're not eliminating parking. You can still drive, but we want you to not have to drive. And the other is there's a lot of people who don't either want to drive, can't drive, or can't afford a car. And we need to really design our localities and communities for everyone, not just for the people who drive.
I do want to kind of put like a finer point on like the second part of your question, which was like, does existing traditional parking policy play into that and the imbalance of the burdens around racial lines? And so I think I think low-income communities and communities of color are more likely to live near polluting industries, landfills, and other environmental hazards, which then leads to higher exposure to toxins and poor health outcomes due to systematic racism and unequal access to political power in decision making. And so I think just to I just want to put a finer point on that, that it's one of those things where it is, because there is systemic racism, any sort of policy at a municipal level, people of color and low income folks are not going to have the political power in decision making that other people have. And so I just kind of wanted to say that outright.
Excellent point. Professor Meng, do you have, from the data that you've got on the impacts of these, like the heat islands and the other environmental impacts, have you done or do you plan to, or do you know of studies that look at that with a socioeconomic layer in the cities as far as where the heating and other environmental impacts are?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of studies that look at heat stress and socioeconomic status, and they all found they disproportionately impact this marginalized community, and along the socioeconomic and racial lines, because this systematic inequality in urban planning, infrastructure, investment. And particularly in the field that I'm in, there's a trend, and I think it's relatively new in the past 5 years, that look at trade inequality across different neighborhoods of the cities. And they found, community with less socioeconomic power often have limited access to green space. And we all know green space provide cooling and recreation and biodiversity, all this benefit. And related to parking, because those land that dedicated to parking lot in urban areas really reduce opportunities to have trees and green space. Um, so this will affect more on underserved neighborhood. So I see in my field there's more and more attention that got paid to look at how to link this physical urban environment with social economic status, and to really quantify how our policy will alter physical environment and how that impacts this marginalized community.
I muted myself and then didn't unmute myself. I have a question. This is around kind of just environmental, the environmental movements in general, and it ties into. I was at Climate Week. I've been trying to get more engaged. PRN's been trying to get more engaged in environmental spaces, and there does seem to be a lot of the attention and the funding in the climate movement and the environmental movement in general, but especially around climate tech and electric vehicles, and not as much around land use or travel. Is this can we have a big enough impact without changing the mode of travel or the way we build our cities? Is this, and I guess, yeah. So I'm just curious if this is something you all have experienced in your conversations, and what strategies we might have to get people to pay a little more attention to this issue.
Absolutely. I would say that there's a number of conversations and groups within the environmental movement have focused on especially electrification and transportation electrification and EVs, as some argue almost like it's a silver bullet to address the massive climate impacts and other emissions that come from vehicles. I, I think that is fundamentally mistaken view. Electric vehicles definitely have a lot of advantages over fossil fuel powered vehicles, and that's certainly, if you're going to buy a car, it should be an electric car. So I don't want to say EVs and electrification doesn't have a role, because I think it has a very significant role in chipping away. As I mentioned, transportation is the largest source of carbon pollution in the country. And transportation electrification, not just of personal vehicles, but trucks, transit buses, school buses, all of this is really important, and we need to do it. But it's not going to solve all of our problems. I mean, there are environmental impacts of mining and manufacturing electric vehicles, for example. But one of the biggest things that EVs won't help us with is our parking problem. And it takes just as much space to park an EV as it does a fossil fuel vehicle. And if you're used to driving and parking wherever you go, you're going to still demand that, even if you are driving an EV, if that's what you're used to. And I mean, it's the same thing, not just for parking, but for, you look at our road capacity and pressure for new and widened highways. And EV takes up the same amount of space on the road as a fossil fuel vehicle. So there are really benefits, absolutely, to EVs, but they are not a sole answer. There's quite a lot, as I mentioned, both the mining and manufacturing, but then also especially focus on the parking question. They require just as many parking spaces as a fossil fuel vehicle does. I think you've got to have a multifaceted approach, in other words, not just electrify, but reform parking, promote cleaner forms like passenger rail and public transit and walkability. I think you've got to do all of those things to tackle the deep environmental problems that transportation causes.
I'm just going to say ditto to everything that Trip just
Yeah, I also totally agree. I think the focus on EV is a step in the right direction. And we are right now at this stage, facing climate crisis, that we don't have the luxury to just cherry pick the strategy we like. We have to consider all the strategies as part of the climate solution. But EV is not enough to achieve the scale of change that required to address the climate crisis comprehensively. So, in addition to this, we have to really think about the change the modes of travel and urban design. Yeah, and not only for climate and environment, but also to address this, um, the social inequality issues.
Thank you. There's an interesting question and a little bit of a discussion in the chat here around some data in the King County around Seattle, showing affordable low-income units struggling to lease up, or maybe not meeting the needs of low-income residents, because they often reduce parking. And the question is, should parking reform focus more on higher income housing types so lower income community isn't bearing the burden of waiting for transit to improve? And I think this is, there's a little bit of additional context in here. And I think this is really an interesting question. And I guess I would say, points to the idea of how far you almost the transit proximity, or there's some other context around this. I think that we see a lot, it has to be near transit or only for affordable housing units. And so so it's an interesting question of where we do apply these, or maybe, and yeah, I'll just leave it there and let the question kind of speak for itself and hear what you guys have to say, if that makes sense.
I'll kind of, yeah. So I don't know about the specific issue, so I'm just going to say that off the bat, at least in this specific area. I think that I do think that there are certain areas within zoning reform that we can look at, especially around parking. So in Harrisburg, North Carolina, I'm going to focus on North Carolina because I live here. But I'm sure that Trip and the professor have much better examples. Um, but in Harrisburg, North Carolina, their population is under 20,000 people. And so in their zoning districts, it's city center and transit-oriented development, they're totally exempt from minimum parking requirements. Um, and so they also implemented parking maximums as well. And they're, to my knowledge, but again, as I said before, I'm not an expert on this, but there are many on this call. So they have done it with parking, getting rid of parking minimums, but then also doing a parking maximum in certain other districts. In Raleigh, North Carolina, that Trip mentioned earlier, it's a population of 500,000 people, and they eliminated parking mandates citywide to impose parking maximums on many other uses. In Charlotte, North Carolina, where I am, the population it's like so close to 1 million that I'm just going to say 1 million. Um, there is no vehicle parking required in or transit-oriented development districts. There is no minimum except for at bars, which in my mind does not make sense because I don't think we want people driving to and from a place that serves alcohol. But so I think that there are exceptions that can be made. And I think if there's a place that is kind of like wanting to tiptoe into getting rid of parking minimums, I think that doing it in like certain districts, maybe like transit-oriented development or city centers, is probably the way to start. And in city centers, there would be, yes, it would impact like some businesses, but it would also impact the people that can afford the massive condos on top of the large buildings. So I do think that they're, phasing it in certain areas might work, and that might work in the Pacific Northwest where this person's talking about.
Are there
Well,
any
I say
other?
likewise, I don't know the specifics, but I think Rebecca's exactly right. You can tailor the areas. You don't have to eliminate parking minimums entirely. And I'm frankly not aware of many places where they've targeted low income for not providing parking for low income housing versus higher income housing. But I'm again not familiar with the particulars. That's why I think it is so important that the localities are considering these, study your locality, look at the patterns, do the research, see where parking, there's a shortage sometimes there's way too much. And again, one of the areas that I think the most dramatic improvements are possible is more commercial parking requirements than it is the residential. So again, I think it's looking at your locality and recognizing there's a range of different ways you can begin to tackle this problem.
I think one of the things is that it's pretty common to provide either greater exemptions, either reductions or greater exemptions for when you provide a low affordable housing. And it's an interesting paradox because one of the arguments of getting rid of mandates is, well, you'll leave it up to the the person spending the money, the person doing the investment. They have the most skin in the game. They're going to look at the environment and figure out if they can lease up a building. And ironically, the state, the government, the municipal government or whatever that might be funding affordable housing is probably the most likely to build an apartment with not enough parking in a not well served by transit area because they don't like, there's not the same. So I don't know really how it's a great question of how you kind of square that circle because the same market pressure doesn't exist. There's a demand for low income housing because people can't afford to live other places. And so it does, it's a tough nut to crack. One thing I want to get to before, just as we approach the end of the session here is for each of you to talk, and I kind of have some specifics here, but like, I mean, specifically for, um, you know, Trip, I'm wondering, how PRN members or partner organizations can, what kinds of things might someone reach out to either Sierra Club or SELC? Are there, and for you, Trip, are there organizations in other regions that are like SELC? And then for all three of you, just, I want to make sure if you can go put it in the chat or whatever, like I know Professor Meng, you had like a link to your research and all that. So just like make sure that we know how and when, everyone share with the audience how and when they might get in touch and reach out to you or your organizations for future stuff.
So there are a number of good points in there. I'll put my email in the chat here in a second. But in terms of just people reaching out and groups we work with, I mean, actually, Rebekah's list of all the people she consulted hit a lot of the types of groups that we tend to work with. But it depends on the locality and building the coalition. But I do think that's one of the strongest things about this movement is the multiple benefits have created some really interesting coalitions. Business developers, commercial businesses, environmentalists, affordable housing advocates, bike ped advocates. I think transit advocates. I think a whole lot of people are starting to see how parking intersects with the things that they care about most deeply. So, I think, Rebekah actually talked some about how you start the campaign and things to do. I think that's one of the hardest things often. I think that's one of the things that the, Parking Reform Network is really helpful, is providing some of that umbrella of information and helping people just see how to even get started and what do they do and where do they go for help. So, I mean, typically, we're a legal and policy group. We don't do the community organizing and building often, but we work with partners who, are present in the community, and everywhere we've had success, we've had very strong community partners. That's absolutely critical. So it's, I mean, I just encourage folks, I mean, thanks to everyone who's on here and interested in the topic. I just think it's an area with enormous potential to address a whole lot of intersecting issues.
I can go. Yeah. So is it the same question for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, when should people reach out to you, and how, on what kinds of topics? Like, yeah, what's the best?
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I like to nerd out about land use a lot. So Sierra Club is mostly powered by volunteers on the ground. And I said earlier there are 64 chapters all across the country. The easiest way to find a chapter is literally just to like put in your state and then Sierra Club. But I'm also more than happy to connect people to their local Sierra Club. And so I'll put my email in the chat again. And so actually Southern Environmental Law Center and Sierra Club have, we're part of like a larger group, focusing on recovery, from Hurricane Helene in North Carolina that I'm kind of like sitting in on. And, so there are ways that like a lot of us could partner. There was actually a partner, Tony, that you said earlier, that was AARP, which I think if you're over the age of 30, you can join, because I know I'm a member, and I'm not going to tell you my exact age, but I definitely joined when I was 30. And so I always found them to be like a really good partner, especially when you're talking about, accessory dwelling units and housing. And another partner is actually Consumer Reports. And a lot of folks don't realize that, yes, they put out that magazine that tells you what electric vehicle or what TV or what, oh gosh, cell phone to buy. But they also have a whole wing of their organization that just does research. And they do a big focus on transportation. I found them to be amazing partners. Um, and I really like the way that Parking Reform Network kind of, as Trip said, is kind of like the umbrella of like, hey, here are all of these examples of parking reform, and here's how you can get organized, and here's the way in which here are some people that you can meet that are also doing this work, which is why I'm super pumped that Sierra Club is a member of Parking Reform Network, because I've definitely been able to kind of touch base with folks that that I can bounce ideas off of to do good trouble when I have my planning commissioner hat on, and then also be able to kind of like push towards some of our amazing staff in cities and states across the country.
Great. And Professor Meng, is there like are there things that like, are you looking for volunteers, or what, how do people engage best with your research going forward, other than following your
Yeah.
lab website?
Yeah. So we would like to like get connected with people who work with community and policy to really develop interdisciplinary research that benefit local communities to inform policy. So we're looking forward to learning more about what has a real need for different regions and different city and counties. And for the research side, in the past, researchers will they study urban, like all the impervious surface as a whole, instead of look at each specific types of impervious surface. So because there's really no data to distinguish parking from road from buildings. But now, because we have this new data set from Parking Reform Network that shows the location and the boundary of each parking lot. So this really make a big difference to move forward the research to look at like the specific contribution of parking lot to urban heat island. And in the future, we expect to see, more detailed investigation analysis that look at each specific type of impervious surface areas in cities to better understand like how different types will contribute to urban stress differently. So I see there's a lot of potential in the research areas, and hopefully there's more conversations like this to bring researchers and policymakers and people who work with community together to come up with very comprehensive solutions.